seems we come to our time to return to the next leg of our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John. You could say that again. All right, yes. So on our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John, we have come quite far. We finished 12 chapters in almost a year. And we still have a way to go. But we turn the page into a new section today. A new section, the final section of the Gospel of John. And that concerns the upper room, what's called the upper room discourse, which is an extended multi-chapter address of Yeshua with his disciples at that Last Supper, that Passover meal. So, and rightfully so. So to summarize the thrust of last week's message, it was a summary of Yeshua's message to the people, condensed in one small last section, Yeshua's greatest hits, if you will. And we asked, why should one believe? It's to become a child of God, a son of God, to partake of the characteristics of Yeshua himself. Next question, if Yeshua is the Messiah, why didn't all Israel believe? There's a very potent theological answer to that, which John gives us by quoting Isaiah, that the majority of the Jewish people have been made blind. They cannot see. This is a theme that is echoed and expanded in Romans chapter 11 by Paul in the New Testament. So, did Yeshua's mission to Israel fail in the sense that only a remnant came to faith? The majority did not recognize or accept Yeshua. So it's a good question. Did Yeshua's mission to Israel fail? No more so than Moses' mission failed. And nobody considers Moses' mission a failure, in that while he redeemed his people, the majority of the children of Israel, the Exodus generation, rebelled and wind up dying in the wilderness, not truly trusting in the God who had liberated them. Only a remnant. In Moses' case, it was only Joshua and Caleb, only two of the Exodus generation who actually came into the promised land. So Yeshua's mission to Israel did not fail. In other words, even though the majority did not accept him, and still to this day has not accepted him. We move on to whose approval do you value most? Many of the people could not reconcile a faith in Yeshua, or didn't know how to reconcile a faith in Yeshua as Messiah, with the fact that they really valued the approval of their peers, of their social class, of society. So that led me to a question I asked you: whose approval do you value most? Who's number one to determine your behavior? Is it your spouse, your family, your friends, fellow believers who exert social pressure on you, that their approval creates value? Colleagues, co-workers, your boss, other way, your employees, the academy, culture. Speaking of academy, you can see, for those of you who watched any part, because I know it's highly unlikely that anybody watched the whole thing, but any part of the Academy Awards, you can very clearly see whose approval matters, whose approval is valued by the American Academy of Arts and Science community. and their responses are based upon the approval of others. I always find it quite funny in a sad, pathetic, humorous way when somebody comes in that community at an award show and makes let's say, an anti-Trump statement, or let's say says, "Hey, I'm saying it out loud. I'm a queer performer of color," as if that's the bravest thing that anyone could ever say in the Hollywood community. Wow, you are against Trump? What courage it took for you to make that statement. Well, you are of a homosexual bent? Okay. What courage for you to actually proclaim it in the midst of the Hollywood community? Or any number of other things. Approval. So approval is very, very important. Whose approval we value most? Social media, the Twitterverse, not in this room, I know. It's God's approval. It's Yeshua's approval that should be in slot number 1. That leads to the next question. Are your priorities or our priorities? And it makes it as if I'm separated from you, but it's our. Are our priorities placed wisely, arranged in the most urgent positions? It's been said, and I think it's probably true, show me a man's checkbook. Of course, very few people use checkbooks today. They've become an endangered species. All right, let's say, show me a man's debit card statement, and I can tell you his priorities. And I think that's true, right? We expend our finances on that which we value most. You can tell what someone's priorities are, whether it's groceries or food or restaurants or fine expensive restaurants or charity or expensive cars or whatever the case. You can tell what someone's priorities are. And so are your priorities placed wisely? Are our priorities? Are they arranged in the most urgent positions? Gospel of John, New Testament, is not telling you that your only priority is God and God alone, as if you live a life of singular focus. We are in the world. Well, not of the world, but we're in the world. And so there are other priorities we have. But the trick is not to remove all priorities from our lives, but a singular focus on God. That makes for quite a dull conversationalist at a cocktail party, I must say. But to make sure that your priorities are placed wisely and that they are arranged in the most urgent positions. The most urgent position, of course, is God, is our Messiah and our relationship with Him. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay, good. Well, that was just review. And then finally, that section ended with Yeshua's greatest hits. And I will reiterate them because they're worth reiterating, because they really summarize a good portion of Jesus' teaching throughout the Gospel of John. 1, Yeshua is sent by the Father as His dependent and obedient revelation and representation. So why should we listen to Yeshua, in other words? Because He is the representation of God. He is the emissary. He is the authorized and obedient revelation of our God. Secondly, Yeshua is the light of the world. The world we've been talking about since chapter 1. The default position for the world is darkness. If there is any light, any spiritual light to be found in the world, it is only through our Messiah. So, look to the light. Number 3, the world determines its own judgment in relation to its reaction to Him and His teaching. The world, before Yeshua came, before the second person of what we call the Trinity, before this the second person came to be incarnated, take on human flesh, in other words, leaving the position that he holds next to with the Father. The world was in darkness, and the world, default position, was judged. Who will save the world that already stood in judgment? It is Yeshua cutting through not the red tape, but the black tape surrounding the human heart. Comes to say, here is the light, here is the way, I am the way, I am and offer the only means of salvation. And so, when one refuses the open, nail-scarred hand of Yeshua as a means of salvation, one is simply accepting the judgment that is already upon him. So the world determines its own judgment in relation to its reaction to him and his teaching. You hear the teaching of Yeshua and say, I could do better, I heard better, not for me. You've made your decision, and the judgment remains on you. Well, fourth, belief in him and his teaching. Again, here's the salvation part. This is the good news part. Belief in him and his teaching. And again, it's not sufficient to believe in one or the other. You must believe in both. You cannot say, I really appreciate the elevated, enlightened teaching of Jesus. I think it's extraordinary, and it stands in the highest tradition of the Jewish prophets and the great philosophers of the world. And by golly, the idea of turning the other cheek and praying for those who persecute, these are elevated ideas I love. But as far as him being Messiah, or certainly as far as him being the only means to God, I'm not sold on that. That's not enough. Conversely, to believe that he is the Messiah, to believe that he is the representation and the revelation of God on earth for man, and to reject and say, I like this what he said, but I don't like the other. I actually do like, I like the fact that a city set on a hill cannot be hid, and do not set your light under a pot, but put it elevated so that all can see your light. I think that's beautiful. But I do not like that turn your other cheek nonsense. I certainly do not like the exclusivity of God. You have to take both the Messiah and his teaching in order to result in eternal life. Otherwise, there's lots of great teach. I have a wonderful book with the elevated teachings of Confucius. That's pretty hot stuff, except Confucius can't save me. You know what's really interesting as well? The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Right? He can't save, well, in a war, maybe in a battle, he's awfully handy. But nonetheless, he can't save me. It's only Yeshua, his teaching, and his person that result in eternal life. Anyway, that's where John 12 leaves off. We now get into new material. Now, before we get into the actual material of chapter 13, the beginning of chapter 13, we have to deal with a problem that has plagued the church since the fourth gospel was published. It's plagued scholars, and that has plagued and confused people. Because there are many people who are very confused about the synoptics tell us the Last Supper occurred on Passover. And we have our Passover Seder, it's the Last Supper. We go through that Last Supper as if it were a Passover Seder, which is what the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us it was. John, it is claimed, because it approaches things differently, it is not giving us Passover. In fact, it is giving us an entirely different date for the dinner. It's giving us an entirely different date for the death of the Messiah. It's saying that they say that John was actually, or Jesus rather, was crucified in John. On the day of Passover, in other words, the day that the lambs were slaughtered. And so there's a contradiction between the Synoptic Gospels and John. To which I say, poppycock. And let me show you why. Many people get their noses out of joint because, first of all, verse 1 begins this way. Now, before the feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Stop. Because so much of scholarship has recognized, has agreed that chapter 12 is a full stop, is a completely different section than chapter 13, they want to begin chapter 13 right here and say, well, it says before the Passover, and then the next verse describes the supper. And so they'll say, see, it says before the Passover, therefore it couldn't be the Passover when the upper room discourse went on. First of all, I'll give you two ways around that impediment. Okay, it's a self-imposed scholastic impediment. Choice number one, okay, way around that number one. The word that's translated before here, before the Feast of Passover, can also be, pro is the Greek word, can also mean at the Feast of Passover. So contextually speaking, both of them would work well here, before or at, unless you have a presupposition because of a number of reasons that this is not actually a Passover meal. But, so choice number one, simply translate the word pro as instead, not before, but at, which actually makes a lot of sense because twice in the verses leading up to this, and the stories leading up to this, John is counting down, saying, now 6 days before the Passover. And then Passover is approaching. As Passover is approaching, and 6 days before the Passover. So we've been getting closer and closer and closer to Passover. And we've had the triumphal entry. And then somehow we want to now stay before the Feast of Passover. It makes more sense contextually since you've had 6 days and then just before, and now you've got at the Passover. So that's choice number one. Choice number two, option number two. Did you know that the chapters and verses were not original to the text? Are you aware of that? The chapters and verses were not original. They were added later on, hundreds and hundreds of years after the text. So people were walking around not being able to cite John chapter 12:49, John chapter 12:50, chapter 13, verse 1. For hundreds of years, it was just one document that led sentence by section, paragraph by paragraph, into the next section. Now, if you simply remove what scholarship has deemed a new section and say that instead of beginning a new section in 13:1, you are actually putting a cherry on top of everything that came before, the ministry of the Messiah, which I think makes perfect sense, or reasonably speaking, that it is not only the capstone of what came before, but it is an entree point to what follows, a hinge verse, in other words. Verse 1 of 13 can actually summarize, just like we had Jesus' greatest hits at the end of chapter 12, so too we can have John summarizing all that Jesus has just said. And that's the way, actually, that's the way that I take this. Okay, so I take it both at the Feast of Passover and that it is the conclusion of the previous section. And that's the first hurdle that one has to pass to demonstrate that this is indeed a Passover Seder. And that there is no contradiction between the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and what John gives us. I mean, think about the gymnastics theologically that one has to jump to say that John contradicts the Synoptic Gospels and say that's okay, because John is just a theological It's one thing, like my position is the cleansing of the temple, which all the three Gospels, they put in Passover week, his final week, and John front loads in chapter 2 and commences. It's one thing to say that John chronologically moves this event to front load and prepare us for the animosity that is going to exist throughout Jesus' ministry between him and the Jewish leaders. It is a completely other thing to say that there is a contradiction. Okay, one can't contradict what the other scriptures say. So, now, reading it that way. Now, at the Feast of Passover, or even before, right before, because we've had 6 days and Passover's approaching, how long is it taking for Passover to get here already? Before the Feast of Passover, at the Feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, which we just read, you'll remember in chapter 12, just a few verses earlier, knowing his hour has come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father. His sojourn here is a temporary one. Walk while you have the light. Having loved his own who were in the world, whom he is rescuing out of the default position of darkness, he loved them to the end. To the end of what? To the end of his life? And he doesn't love them anymore after his death, burial, and resurrection? Is that the way I'm supposed to read this? Is that what John means? He loved them to the end. To the end of what? To the end of the gospel? To the end of the Passover week? This word, tell us. Tell us what? No, that's the word, tell us. Not going to get into an Abbott and Costello routine with you over this word. But this word indicates to the culmination, to the very goal, to the point where there's no more love to give. In other words, when John tells us that Yeshua loved his disciples to the end, it means that he loves them to the last drop. If I can love Maxwell House and it's good all the way to the last drop, I want to make sure I can get everything out of it. Okay, that's what his love to the very last drop of his disciples. Another way of viewing that or saying that concept is you squeeze a lemon, and if you do a lousy job squeezing a lemon, there's still plenty of juice left in that lemon. Let's be honest, right? But if you really, really get after and you get that very last drop of lemon juice, that's what Jesus was squeezed. His love was squeezed to the very last drop. He had no more. This is the man whose love is infinite. No more love to give, with infinite love. In other words, to the utmost. He loved his disciples to the utmost. And that's a beautiful way to end the previous section. And it's a beautiful way to begin the Last Supper conversation, which is what we're going to see in this passage begin. Now, the Last Supper was held in an upper room. Synoptics tell us a whole lot more, and we will go through the basic structure of the Last Supper at our Passover Seder in just a few months, 2 months from now. But if you've been to Israel, this is the traditional upper room. And whether it's the spot or not, it's nearby the spot. And of course, this is a Gothic medieval. You see the arches. It didn't look like that. But nonetheless, this is the traditional location, an upper room. And again, it is the celebration of the Feast of Passover, which by the time one is actually having a Seder has become at that point the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. In the Bible, the Passover, which is a 1-day celebration, and the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread are smushed together, are combined together as one nice big giant complex of holidays. The Passover lambs are sacrificed on Passover. The Passover Seder is eaten at the sundown when Passover is now done. The lambs have been slaughtered. They are on the spit, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. That's where we are. The 15th of Nisan is that's the month, not the car, is just dawning, or dawning is actually not the great word because it's the sun's going down, but it's just commencing. The 14th is ended. The 15th, this is a Passover meal. Now, in ancient times, and certainly in the time of the Second Temple Judaism, and that's the time of the Gospels, when one ate a banquet, this is not a Jewish sculpture, but nonetheless it shows you how meals were eaten by wealthy aristocrats, and it was eaten reclining on one's left elbow and eating with the right hand. This is a wealthy guy who's being served. Wanted to show you this. This is Ashurbanipal, a famous Assyrian king. It's from the British Museum, and you see he is reclining on a couch and being served by his servants. And if you look actually all the way in the very top end of the left corner, you see there's a tree, and hanging from the tree is the head of one of his enemies. Don't mess with Ashurbanipal from the 7th century Assyria. He's reclining. And then, of course, we have this fellow here who's reclining. So you see the wealthy people reclined while they ate. And what would it have looked like? It would have looked something like this. Well, whether you're on cushions or couches or very, very low on pillows, what have you, they are reclining and leaning in toward a table with their feet outside and away from the table. Another position, another possibility of what it looked like. This is a fancy position like this, and you can see people could serve the banqueteers by being able to walk in through the open section in the middle, but everybody's leaning in, feet out, head in, arms being able to reach, leaning on left arms. Okay. One reproduction of what the arrangements may have been this is from Alfred Edersheim's Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, and you have the disciples around this table, much like the picture we just saw, and then you have John in the very end, followed by Jesus, followed by Judas right next to him. So one sitting to his, or laying, reclining to his right, and one to his left. Peter across from John, which will make sense when we get to that passage next week. Now, having set the stage, let's get into the text. During supper, what supper? The Passover meal. It's assumed because he's been leading us to Passover for 3 chapters now. And to say this is not a Passover is... Anyway, enough said. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, Iscariot, to betray him, to betray Yeshua. In other words, what John is doing, he's dispensing with the formalities of what the Passover meal looked like, of the institution of the Eucharist, of communion service. That's been covered beautifully, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Wants to talk about the dinner conversation. John wants to cover the dinner conversation, the last words, the last address of Yeshua to his disciples. So during supper, we're beginning with the betrayal of the Messiah. The devil having already put into the heart of Judas, and this is a very interesting issue. We've been asking for 2,000 years, what is the motivation for Judas to have betrayed Jesus? Playwrights and scholars and authors have been wrestling and imagining what is the motivation behind it. The most famous, of course, many of us are familiar with, is Jesus Christ Superstar, which is written, the musical written actually from the position of Judas and from his point of view. And it gives us all this wonderfully imaginative reasons as to, well, he's disillusioned. He's hoping that Yeshua will be brought to his senses, and that if he's actually brought on trial, he'll recant some of his more extremist statements. He's got nothing but the best intentions for Yeshua. Well, John cuts through all of that imaginative, interesting stuff and simply says that the reason that Judas betrayed Yeshua is because he entered into an agreement. Again, not a purposeful, hey, Satan, shall we have an agreement? Shake. No. But it's an agreement, being influenced by the devil and agreeing to march to the devil's point of view, an itinerary. Judas, a close disciple. I mean, let's not imagine that for 3 years, or however long Yeshua's ministry was, that Judas is somehow infiltrated this band of disciples. He didn't infiltrate, he was chosen by Jesus. And let's not imagine that when the lights go out every night, when the last candle is blown out, that Judas is nefariously wringing his hands together. My plan is working. Judas had to have been a true part of the disciples. And with the agenda. And then slowly, something changes. We've already been introduced chapters earlier that he's been helping himself to the treasury. He's entrusted with the money bag, and so all the disciples have great confidence in him. Jesus knows, but nonetheless they entrust him with the money, and he's been embezzling the money, taking a little bit for himself. So slowly, he's lost his fervor for this and is now into his own reasons. And it tells us that his own reason here is that the devil has already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus. He's already arranged this. The synoptics tell us how it went down during that Passover preparation week. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, all things, not into Judas' hands, into Jesus' hands, Yeshua's hands. And that's all things, not some things, not most things, but all things, including control over whether or not to wipe out Judas in an instant, if he wanted to, and to stymie the betrayal. But the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God. Jesus must be betrayed, he must be rejected, and he must be crucified. In fact, that's how we know that our choice for Messiah is actually the right one. Because the Bible tells us, the Hebrew Bible tells us, that the Messiah, when he comes, will be the one who is despised and abhorred by the nation. That's how we know he's the Messiah, because he was despised and abhorred by the nation. Nonetheless, he was going forth, he had come from God and was going back to God. Got up from supper, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Now, many people say, what's this all about? Why is Yeshua going to wash the feet of his disciples? And they make a big deal out of Yeshua. Oh, well, he's taking on the role of a servant. He's taking on the role of a slave. And he's washing the feet of the disciples just like a slave. And look at how humble Jesus is. And that's really not going on. When you think about what Passover is and how Passover begins. When Passover is just about to begin, you have the first cup. Right after the first cup, there's no dinner yet. Passover hasn't been served. The meal hasn't commenced yet. What happens is the washing of hands, the ceremonial washing of hands of the one who is going to lead the Seder meal. It's not because his hands are dirty. It is a ceremony. Who can approach the mountain of the Lord, the hill of the Lord? He who has pure heart and clean hands. It is a ceremonial purifying, a hand washing. But he got up from supper, he laid aside his garments, taking a towel, he girded. This is very strange. This is not part of the normal Passover meal. Then he poured water into a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he's girded. So, the way the hand washing goes is there is a basin, there is a pitcher, and the pitcher has water in it, and the pitcher is poured over the hand, and then the other hand, and into a basin. So you have a basin, you have a pitcher. It's another picture of what it looks like, okay? The pitcher, the basin. Yeshua, instead of doing this for himself to kick off that Passover, he gets up, and all of a sudden he's taking off his outer garments, because if you're going to get down on the floor, it's going to get messy and rumpled, but also it could get a little soggy. And so he takes things off, and he takes a basin and a pitcher, same way, and gets up. And remember where the feet of the apostles are, the disciples are. They're pointing away from the tent. So if he walks around them, he has good access to them. He simply, one by one, and starting, according to Edersheim, I think wisely, starting with Peter, at the end of the configuration, begins to wash the feet of his disciples. Very different than just ceremonial washing your hand. And the issue is, he's not washing their feet because the feet are dirty, taking the role of a slave. You know how I know this? Because they're in an upper room. They've already begun the Passover procedure. They've already taken their positions. The moment that they walk into the upper room, there is a servant, there is a family member, there's somebody there who would have washed their feet so that the couches, the cushions, and the upper room don't get dirty. That's just the way it was done. That's protocol, right? When you walk into somebody's home, you walk into my home, okay, generally, just because we like that, but generally most people like it as well, we're going to take our shoes off, walk into our homes, right? Because why would we it's not like we have a foot wash, but if we do have stuff on our shoes, we have a mat on the outside, and we also have a mat on the inside that somebody can go like this, okay? But you wouldn't think of sitting down at somebody's table for dinner without at least, if not taking off your shoes, at least giving them a good wipe on the mat outside or the mat inside, or both. So some slave has already washed. The feet of the disciples are not carrying the dust of the road. He's not washing them for cleanliness. It's already been done. Does that make sense? So he came to Simon Peter. And Simon said to him, Peter said to him, Lord, you wash my feet? What are you doing? This is, first of all, my feet have already been washed just like everybody else. It's redundant. Number two, you wash your hands. And later on in the ceremony, we're all going to ceremonially wash our hands, just like the leader of the Seder is going to do. We'll wash our hands. But why are you washing our feet? You're breaking protocol here. What are you inventing here? What are you innovating here? It's not seemly for you to wash my feet. And it's not appropriate. And Jesus answered and said to him, what I do now, you do not realize now. So, first of all, understand that Peter understands the process of water touching feet and, poured over feet as washing feet. So that's not what Peter doesn't understand right now. The significance, however, is what Peter is only going to get later, and the rest of the disciples only going to get later after the crucifixion and resurrection. What I do now, you do not realize, but you will understand hereafter. Not 5 minutes from now, but in several days. And Peter said, never shall you wash my feet. You're not my slave. You're not my servant. Yeshua answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. You have no heritage with me. You have no connection with me unless I wash you. What, the only connection that Peter gets with Yeshua rests on a little bit of water, a little pouring of water? What does Jesus mean when he says, if I do not wash you, you have no part of it? Could he possibly be using wash in a deeper way? Let's find out. Simon Peter said to him, well, if that's the way you want to have it, if that's the way you put it, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands. Let's go ahead. If we're going to jump the gun now, so we're not just washing hands, we're washing feet. Let's wash the hands, and we'll go ahead at this point, go ahead and wash the head too. Some people go a little further and say, well, Peter's just saying, then give me a bath, because I really want to be part of you. No, Peter's just a little unbridled enthusiasm there for this new program, whatever it is that Jesus is doing. Peter's game, because Peter loves Jesus. And Yeshua said to him, well, he was bathed, needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. Let's take a look at what he means here. Everybody took a dip in the mikveh before Pesach, before Passover. So everybody's already had a bath, a ceremonial ritual bath, but it's to clean. Their bodies are clean, right? But from the time that you take the mikveh to the time you get to the upper room, you're walking on dirty streets, dusty streets, or whatever, so everybody's feet gets dirty. Right? So that's why there's a slave. That's why there's somebody, a servant, somebody who's going to, before you come into the house, is going to pour water over your feet to wash the dust of the road off the feet. So that's why he says, he was bathed, and you've already bathed. We're all mikvah'd up here. Needs only to wash his feet, right? And then you're completely clean. It's all done. Right? You just need a little top off or bottom off feet. And you are clean. But not all of you. I love how Jesus is the master of the double entendre. He goes from talking about being physically clean and a physical act to something spiritual. You're all clean. He's not saying, but you, Judas, you skipped the mikvah. You are not clean. No. He's moved from physical to spiritual, but you have to be paying attention, right? And sometime in the moment, you can miss that. You're clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. So, lest the reader miss the double entendre, John spells it out. That's for those of us who are from Rio Linda. All right. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and so listen, and so don't think that Jesus is getting naked. He's not becoming Tarzan in a loincloth, right? Taking the outer garment off only because, again, cumbersome and soggy. He's still wearing something. Okay? And he girds himself with a towel. The towel's not like, like when you come out of the shower and you're wearing a towel, look at me. No, it's a big strip of linen, and he tied it around, and then he have, imagine you have a lot of material over here, you can swing it around that's to wipe off the feet, right? So you have it, where you don't have to hold the towel, you get around it, and you can just wipe off, polish off those toenails, whatever you're going to do, you can wipe off the feet. When he washed the feet, taken his garments, and reclined at the table again. And notice it says recline, right? Don't ever miss the recline. They're not sitting at a table. They're reclining. I showed you a couple different ways they could have done it. He said to them, do you know what I have done to you? And the assumption is, no, they don't. In fact, they're really not going to see the full significance of it until after his death and resurrection. You call me teacher. It's another way of saying rabbi. It's not the word for rabbi here, but it's the word that means exactly as teacher. That's what rabbi meant. You call me teacher and Lord, master. Not Lord as in Lord my God. That comes later in chapter 20 when they see the resurrected Messiah. You call me Adon, Mar, Lord. And you are right, for so I am. Right? You're my disciples. I am your master. I'm your teacher. You're my acolytes. You're my Talmudim is another way to say it in Hebrew. For so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, the master and the teacher, if I washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Now, don't misunderstand Yeshua. He's not saying, now I want you to do this in perpetuity, and every time you get together, or at least once a year, I want to make sure that you do this as some kind of a sacrament or some kind of ordinance. We're going to have an ordinance of feet washing. There's some denominations who actually do that, but I don't think that's what Yeshua is saying here. There's a principle, because, again, what I'm doing now, you won't understand until later. They understand that he's pouring water, so that's beyond pouring water. That's not the issue that he's getting at here. They would have gotten that right then. If I washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. What was it that Yeshua actually did? Physically, he took water and poured it up, but applicationally, what he did was serve. He, the master, he, the big kahuna, he, the big chief, he got down, literally lowering himself, physically lowering himself, and served in a position of humility, served those who are absolutely lower than himself. They're in a lower position, but he lowered himself to their level and served them with humility. It's an example that you should do as I did to you. Goes on to say, amen, amen. Remember when he says, truly, truly, amen, amen. You take this to the bank. I'm front-loading this with a certainty that it's unmatched. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master. Pretty obvious. Nor is one who is sent, an emissary, greater than the one who sent him. They're apostles, they're emissaries. And he is the one who is sending them, or is going to send them out. You are not greater than me. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And that's where this section ends, with a beatitude. Blessed are you if you know these things and you do them. So am I blessed if I take a pitcher of water and I walk down the aisle and sprinkle, 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 pour, sprinkle, sprinkle, pour, pour, pour a lot over there? That's not the point. The point is that if Jesus, our Messiah, our Master, our Lord, could lower himself to the very lowest of social positions, doing the most menial of tasks, which, if you think about it, is simply an outworking, it's a dramatic reenactment of what the one who had been sent by God, who condescended, who lowered himself from the very presence of the Father to come and walk among humanity and live with humanity and experience the indignities of life with humanity. If he could lower himself in order to serve those whom he loved, then we must do likewise. So as we think about the table, as we think about remembering the Last Supper, when we think about the death, burial, resurrection of our Messiah, what he's done for us, the humility he exercised in lowering himself to serve us, the question that I want you to ponder is, how are you carrying out and following in the example of our Messiah? It is not hard to recognize that the creator of the universe is greater than us, and therefore we serve him and worship him. To say God is great and God is good is not a great intellectual, moral, or ethical stretch of anyone's imagination. However, for us to come and look around the room, we know one another. I know you. You are not the masters of the universe. Neither am I. We are all flawed. And yet he calls us to follow his example and serve one another. So, I'm not asking you today when you take communion, are you serving God? If you're not serving God, then don't participate in the communion. It's obviously not for you. You're not right with the Lord if you're not in right relationship, which is, hey, servant, master, worshiper, worshipped, creature, creator. But the question that I have on a horizontal level, whom are you serving? Now, I know there's some people in here, for example, and I'm not going to name any names, but I think it's a great example, who spend time weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever the case may be, going into prisons and spending time with those who are in prison. That, I think, is a wonderful and beautiful application of serving others. Now, that's dramatic and that's big. There are others who tirelessly serve and make sure that when we have our dinners and we have our weekly bagel breakfast, that we have everything is just right and just so, and that everything is placed on a platter beautifully, and various different flavors of schmear are available for us. And then it's cleaned up. We come in here, and magically, all that stuff disappears. That's service. Right now, we have men and women in the classrooms with talking about lowering yourself, right? They are, instead of being here with their peers, with their adults, and being fed directly from their shepherd, from their pastor, they have sacrificed that time, and they have decided to serve the least of these, our children. That's a beautiful reflection of what it means to wash one another's feet in a practical way. Each one of you, as we take communion, I want you to think about ways that you are. It's not self-glorification to say, hey, well, this is how I am serving others. This is one way that I'm carrying out washing others' feet. No, that's just self-assessment. That's good. But the other side of self-assessment is to recognize that I am doing, but the other side is, I'm not doing, or I'm not doing as much as I could be doing, and I haven't thought about it, and here's an area where I could serve. That's one of the reasons that the new members all have an area on the application form. Where will you serve? It's not because we're a demanding congregation. It's that we want to be faithful to our Messiah and give you the opportunity to choose an area of service so that you can spiritually wash one another's feet. Speaking of which, by the way, next week is our induction of our new members for this particular time of the year. So if you haven't gotten in your application, or I haven't heard or read your testimony, now is the time. I've received many, but I know there are still more that are out there. Let me light a fire under your tuchas and tell you that this is the week. Otherwise, you're not graduating with the rest of the class, the first class of 2020. But nonetheless, let's come forward and let's distribute the communion, shall we? I want you to think about this. Where am I serving? Where can I serve? And am I serving to the extent that our Messiah calls us to? Take some time. Think about this. Let's go ahead and distribute them. We'll take some silence. Oh, and we have gluten-free. Debbie's got the gluten-free in the golden open container there so that nobody's left out except your pastor. Thank you. Upper room discourse is pretty cool because it really fills in a lot of details regarding the dinner conversation, the concerns that our Messiah had to share. The Synoptic Gospels gives us just, a skeleton form of a Passover and demonstrating the origins of the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving, the communion, the new era in human history that Yeshua establishes with the inauguration of the new covenant and the giving of his body. But the upper room discourse, in a sense, puts flesh on the bones of that skeleton, of that outline. It really prepares us for understanding the death of our Messiah. What was on Yeshua's heart as he prepared in the hours immediately prior to his arrest and his trial and his execution? What was foremost in his mind? What was of greatest concern to communicate to those whom he loved to the end before he was to be crucified? We're in for an exciting adventure together over the next few months as we wind up the Gospel of John, but spending so much time as we will in the upper room, as John does in the upper room with this discourse. This is a great preparation for it. And I'm glad that John included this act, because it really does prepare us for everything that is to come. In the evening that Yeshua was betrayed, he took bread, unleavened bread, Passover, unleavened bread, and he said, "This is my body, and it's given for you, and do this in remembrance of me." Let's do so. And then after supper, he took the third cup, the cup of redemption, and he said this. See, what John is doing here with the foot washing, Jesus adding new and exciting meaning, adding a whole nother layer of redemptive meaning to the activities of Passover. This happens through and through each one of the Gospels, with the bread, with the cup, with the washing of the hands, and now the feet. But with this third cup, he says, "This is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for the many, for the forgiveness of sin." Are you the many? I'm the many. Jew and Gentile alike, reconciled to God, forgiven of our sins because of what this cup represents, the blood of our Messiah. Let us do this in remembrance of him. Our Father and our God, we thank you so much that you sent your Son to die for us, to suffer on our behalf, to live a perfect life, and to love us to the extent that he still does, to the very last drop, to the last bit of juice could be extricated from a bottomless and limitless quantity of source. We thank you so much for that great love and for that great example. In the name of Yeshua we pray. Amen.